Well, the dollar is up 60% to the Russian ruble, which had been gaining power since the conflict in Ukraine began. So, what's going on? We've been told that the ruble is just fine, but now it seems like maybe it's not. So, we wanted to get some perspective on this. If you track these things, the dollar usually buys around 80 rubles or so in recent months, and it jumped to over 100 this week before settling down in the mid 90s. Russia's central bank held an emergency meeting this week and raised interest rates to 12%, up from 8.5%. So, redacted correspondent Mike Jones, he lives in Russia. He follows East West relations, and he brings us some insight on the matter. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Okay, so is it a total freakout right now economically, or can you provide us some context?
Not in Russia, no. This has been tracked very carefully by the Russian central bank. It's a freakout in the West, and Politico and The Economist, who don't seem to understand Russian economics, quite frankly. The Russian central bank have come out with this rate rise, bearing in mind that they haven't changed the rates since September, I believe, of last year from this 8.5%. I'll just quote the Bank of Russia, actually, where they're very forthright on some of the factors that have affected their decision. They put here, for example, when oil prices rise, the ruble strengthens, which reduces the risk of overheating of the economy, while when oil prices fall, the ruble weakens, which supports domestic producers by increasing exports and stimulating import substitution. Just that quote gives you an idea of this past year that Russia has been through and quite why the ruble has been allowed to get to this level, which quite clearly was 100. That seemed to trigger this, what was called extraordinary meeting of the Central Bank of Russia. The West has seized on that as panicked. They've called the ruble as plummeting, which is not the case. Even if you go to xe.com and track the ruble, it has been a very steady decline to this point. A plummet was March in 2022. That was a plummet. So you can
Yes.
see the clear difference. Oil prices, as we know, have been a big factor. It's not really mentioned in many of these Western articles about the oil price cap. We heard a lot about that for a long time, but then it seems to have slipped off the news cycle. Why? I suspect because in about mid-July, Russian oil has been, well, Urals, crude oil, has been trading above the agreed $60 price cap.
The price gap you mentioned is when the European Union decided, well, we're still going to buy oil from Russia, but we'll cap it at a certain rate. And Russia said, that's not how this works. Is that what you're talking about?
Let's focus on India, where the Financial Institute of Kiev is now accusing them of inflating shipping costs in order to circumvent these measures. I don't want to focus too much on oil because, of course, Russia's been accused of being a gas station and masquerading as an economy. One of the big changes, as I discussed previously with Clayton, was the grain deal. Since 2014, in the first wave of sanctions that Russia learned from and weathered, Russia was, previous to 2014, a food importer.
Mhm.
Today, if you fast forward, Russia is a food exporter, exporting certainly grain and, in particular, animal feed to Africa, Egypt, one of the big buyers, and of course, affecting the prices of agricultural feed, which feeds into this impact in these Western economies and the West's reaction. The point being that this weaker ruble has meant that Russia has, on its exports, gained more rubles, and therefore, same with food, same with oil. It's been to Russia's interest, but now, as the central bank admits, it's reached the point where domestic industry cannot be further expanded anymore to meet consumer demand. And therefore, that's resulting in heightening imports, which, as they admit, has increased inflation. Hence, this measure now to try and manage that with this interest rate hike.
Okay, so Russia has, I can't remember now, $60 billion frozen in the central currency because the United States did that as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. So has that had a negative impact overall? Do we still see any reverberations of that move?
No, you're correct that on February 24th, one of the mechanisms the central bank tried to employ was what's called foreign currency intervention. This is where they use their international reserves. Of course, those were frozen by at least February 28th, and that ruled out that mechanism. As a result, they employed other currency measures, restrictions that successfully brought down inflation. The It's quite a nuanced topic there. You have what's called a floating exchange rate, and there's two subtypes. There's free floating and then what's called controlled. I believe what the Russian central bank uses is this controlled floating exchange rate. So they use things like this interest rate to either strengthen or weaken the ruble as they seem to deem fit.
So, what that was an example, the first example of the United States weaponizing the US dollar, which will shake confidence in any other country that has a reserve that's dollar based like that. But inside Russia, we've seen record low inflation. So, can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to just buy ordinary goods? Has there been this massive influx of, or fluctuation rather, in consumer prices?
Yeah, up until a certain point, there was very low inflation. That has given the Russian economy room to maneuver, which they have played to their advantage, particularly with domestic industry. One of the reasons for this extraordinary meeting is in the past 2 months, I've noticed in particular on foreign produced goods, so let's say electronics, there has been a marked and very noticeable increase in these prices, even week by week. For the Russian economy, it's been very painful in the automotive sector, where I've seen regular news of not just increases, and I'm talking about anywhere from 200,000 to 400,000 ruble price increases, but even the Russian government instructing the likes of Lada to produce an economy version or cut costs as best they can. So they've tried to stave off this key rate interest hike for as long as possible through these means and measures. But that's where we've seen this balancing act between the import and the export and the domestic production side of the economy.
Okay. And so, is there, we know that regularly the Russian government communicates with its people like, this is going to be, a period of adjustment. It's going to be like this. So, is there good communication besides the central bank press release telling people who live in Russia, what to expect in the recent future? And what is the sentiment, I suppose?
It takes a lot to phase the Russian people, given from 1998, 2008, 2014, all the shocks that they have had to go through. So actually, in the scheme of things, even 2022 was just a ripple in the pond. The communication, from my perspective, has been excellent, both from the Russian central bank, even President Putin himself, been very quite frank and honest with the situation from the speeches that I've seen at these various economic events and when he has talked to foreign partners about the state of the Russian economy. I would like to add there, before people think, oh, wow, yes, with these increases in prices and inflation, the Russian economy truly is collapsing. I'll just note that the IMF itself was accused of pushing Putin propaganda because of their optimistic forecasts, where they downgraded the severity of the contraction of the GDP. And the World Economic Report placed Russia, I believe, as the largest economy in Europe, larger than Germany now. So the economy itself is very strong. And that is in part due to these measures by Elvira Nabiullina and the communication from the Russian central bank, where there has been no runs on the bank. There has been no panic, certainly not since March 2022, when the sort of shock and awe sanctions were unleashed in the first instance.
Yeah, and I think that those of us in the West, we underestimate it at our peril when we buy these headlines of like, oh, see, we told you their economy's collapsing. Then it creeps up on us that there's a reality that we didn't understand. So thank you for bringing us this perspective. It's something we should continue to follow. And we will watch with interest, especially as we watch this sort of move away from the United States as the central global currency and other countries going through these growing pains in order to become more financially independent, and just see what happens. So good to talk to you as always. Would you like to tell anyone where they can find you outside of this platform?
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, Telegram is probably my primary outlet, t.me/ILGray TV, where I share such news like this and the commentary that I provide there. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.